Deep like the ocean, by Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu. The Suttas tell of numerous occasions when the Buddha and his disciples were presented with a list of 10 questions to see what the Buddha's position was on the hot philosophical topics of the day. Apparently, the list was meant to cover all the possible positions that could be taken on those topics, but in every case, the Buddha and his disciples stated that he didn't take any of the 10. 4 of the questions concerned the existence or non-existence of a Tathagata, a fully awakened being, such as the Buddha or an arahant disciple, after death. These questions are called a tetralemma because they entertain 4 possible positions. The Tathagata exists after death. The Tathagata doesn't exist after death. The Tathagata both exists and doesn't exist after death. The Tathagata neither exists nor doesn't exist after death. This would seem to cover all the possible positions that could be taken on this issue, but just for good measure, when a young monk told a group of sectarians that the Buddha taught that the Tathagata after death could be described otherwise than by any of these 4 positions, the Buddha later rebuked him as well, SN 2286. Given the thoroughness with which the early suttas reject all possible ways of describing the Tathagata after death, it's always something of a surprise when Buddhists maintain that a fully awakened person doesn't exist after death. Those who defend this position insist that their way of holding to it falls outside the tetralemma because, in their eyes, every position listed in the tetralemma assumes that the Tathagata has a self. They, however, adopting the no-self version of the not-self teaching, insist that the Tathagata never had a self to begin with, so their position isn't ruled out by the Buddha's rejection of those 4 positions. In other words, the proponents of this position assume, in effect, that the word exist in the tetralemma means continues to exist. So when the first possibility says the Tathagata exists after death, it's actually saying the Tathagata continues to exist after death. When the second possibility says the Tathagata doesn't exist after death, it's actually saying the Tathagata doesn't continue to exist after death. This argument would reject both positions on the grounds that the Tathagata doesn't exist prior to death, so there's nothing to continue or not continue. However, the closest the Buddha gets to using an argument like this to reject all 4 possibilities in the tetralemma is in SN 44-7 and SN 44-8. In SN 44-7, he notes that wanderers of other sects would take any of these positions because they assume, with regard to any of the 6 sense spheres, that this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am. In SN 44-8, he states that they take the positions because they assume a self identical to any of the 5 aggregates, possessing any of the 5, in any of the 5, or containing any of the 5 within it. He, however, doesn't make any of these assumptions, which is why he doesn't take any of these positions. But this is not to say that he held to the view that there is no self. In MN2, he lists the questions, do I exist, and do I not exist, as unworthy of attention. From there, he goes on to state that the views that come from trying to answer questions like these, including the view, I have no self, along with the view, I have a self, are a thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, a writhing of views, a fetter of views. Bound by a fetter of views, the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person is not freed from birth, aging, and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair. He is not freed, I tell you, from suffering and stress. So there's no reason to believe that the Buddha or his awakened disciples would have used the view that there is no self as their basis for rejecting the tetralemma. And there are at least 3 other reasons for suspecting that neither he nor they would have approved of the argument for using the view that there is no self in this way. The first reason is that any attempt to describe the existence or non-existence of a Tathagata after death has to fall under the tetralemma, no matter how you define exists. For example, even if, for the sake of argument, we were to accept the idea that exists in the tetralemma means continues to exist, then if you reject the first 2 possibilities of the tetralemma on the grounds that there's nothing to continue existing or not, then your position would have to fall under the 4th possibility. The Tathagata neither continues to exist nor doesn't continue to exist after death. In other words, if you say your description is not X and not X, then it would be accurately described as neither X nor not X. What this means is that as soon as you try to describe the existence or non-existence of the Tathagata after death, regardless of whether you assume or don't assume a self prior to death, you still have to fall into one of the four members of the tetralemma, all of which the Buddha refuses to affirm. Second, even if it were possible to define the first two members of the tetralemma in any other way to avoid the problem just noted, SN 2286 rules out any ways of describing the Tathagata after death that would fall outside the tetralemma. So they would have to be rejected too. Third, if the Buddha meant to imply that the tetralemma is unacceptable because it's assuming a self that the Tathagata never had, either before or after awakening, then the Buddha would have refused to adopt any of the alternatives of the tetralemma, not only with regard to fully awakened beings, but also with regard to all beings, on the grounds that no one has ever had a self. But as the Buddha said in SN 44-9, he designated the birth, meaning rebirth, of one who has clinging, and not of one without clinging. And we can see many instances in the canon where he describes the birth even of those who have gained any of the noble attainments but have not yet reached full awakening. Monks, Suppabuddha the leper was wise. With the destruction of the first three fetters, he is a stream winner, not subject to states of deprivation, headed for self-awakening for sure. Having acquired conviction, virtue, learning, relinquishment, and discernment on encountering the Dhamma and Vinaya made known by the Tathagata, now, on the breakup of the body, after death, he has reappeared in a good destination, a heavenly world, in company with the Devas of the heaven of the 33. There he outshines the other Devas both in beauty and in rank. Ud 5-3 monks, the clansman Pukusati was wise. He practiced the Dhamma in accordance with the Dhamma, and did not pester me with issues related to the Dhamma. With the destruction of the 5 lower fetters, he has arisen spontaneously in the pure abodes, there to be totally unbound, never again to return from that world. MN 140. It's also the case that the Buddha had no qualms about describing how beings get reborn in general. When, in SN 44-9, Tathagata asks him, and at the moment when a being sets this body aside and is not yet reborn in another body, what do you designate as its sustenance then? The Buddha didn't say that there was no being. He answered categorically, Vaka, when a being sets this body aside and is not yet reborn in another body, I designate it as craving sustained, for craving is its sustenance at that time. These passages indicate that the Buddha refused to describe Tathagatas after death because of something that sets them apart from beings who are not fully awakened. And SN 44-9 tells us clearly what that is. They're without clinging, whereas beings are not. Why this would make Tathagatas indescribable, and why all 4 members of the tetralemma thus don't apply to them, is related to the Buddha's discussions of how beings are defined. As he was sitting there, Van Rada said to the Blessed One, "A being, Lord, a being," it said. To what extent is there said to be a being? Attached to, sata, caught up in, visita, any desire, passion, delight, or craving for form, rada, a being, sata, it is said. Attached to, caught up in any desire, passion, delight, or craving for feeling, perception, fabrications. Attached to, caught up in any desire, passion, delight, or craving. For consciousness, a being, it is said. SN 23-2. The way the Buddha plays with the meanings of sata in this passage doesn't mean that he's only playing with words here. We have to remember that wordplay, in the context of his culture, was often used for very earnest purposes to make one's teachings memorable. And the importance of the point he's making here is underscored by the fact that he makes essentially the same point again in another sutta, this time without recourse to wordplay. If one stays obsessed with form, monk, that's what one is measured by. Whatever one is measured by, that's how one is classified. If one stays obsessed with feeling, if one stays obsessed with perception, if one stays obsessed with fabrications, if one stays obsessed with consciousness, that's what one is measured by. Whatever one is measured by, that's how one is classified. But if one doesn't stay obsessed with form, monk, that's not what one is measured by. Whatever one isn't measured by, that's not how one is classified. if one doesn't stay obsessed with feeling, if one doesn't stay obsessed with perception, if one doesn't stay obsessed with fabrications, if one doesn't stay obsessed with consciousness, that's not what one is measured by. Whatever one isn't measured by, that's not how one is classified, as Sin 22:36. In other words, beings are defined by their clingings and attachments. When they let go of all their clingings and attachments, there's nothing by which they can be defined. When you can't define them, you can't describe them. After all, to describe something, you first have to pinpoint exactly what it is. It's for this reason that Buddhas and Arahants after death can't be described by any of the four positions of the tetralemma, or by any other position at all, because they can't be defined as beings, or as anything else. The canon itself makes this connection in the reasons it gives for why the Buddha and his disciples would not take any of the four positions of the tetralemma. These reasons fall into two types, formal and strategic. The formal reasons are related to the basic rules of discussion. In this case, the rule that if you want to discuss whether something exists, you first have to define what it is you're talking about. The strategic reasons are related to the actual impact the act of asking and answering a given question would have on the mind, and, in particular, whether it would be helpful in putting an end to suffering and stress or actually get in the way. The Suttas' formal reasons for rejecting the tetralemma are based on the fact that, given that you can't measure or define the Tathagata, it's not legitimate to describe him as existing, not existing, both, or neither after death. Sister Kemma, what do you think, great king? Do you have an accountant or calculator or mathematician who can count the grains of sand in the river Ganges as so many grains of sand, or so many hundreds of grains of sand, or so many thousands of grains of sand, or so many hundreds of thousands of grains of sand? King Pasenyudi, no, lady. Then do you have an accountant or calculator or mathematician who can count the water in the great ocean as so many buckets of water, or so many hundreds of buckets of water, or so many thousands of buckets of water, or so many hundreds of thousands of buckets of water? No, lady. Why is that? The great ocean is deep, boundless, hard to fathom. Even so, great king, any form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness by which one describing the Tathagata would describe him, that the Tathagata has abandoned, its root destroyed, made like a palmyra stump, deprived of the conditions of development, not destined for future arising, freed from the classification of form, feeling, perception, fabrications. Consciousness, great king, the Tathagata is deep, boundless, hard to fathom, like the great ocean. The Tathagata exists after death doesn't apply. The Tathagata doesn't exist after death doesn't apply. The Tathagata both exists and doesn't exist after death doesn't apply. The Tathagata neither exists nor doesn't exist after death doesn't apply. As Sin 44:1. In the same way, Vaka, any form by which one describing the Tathagata would describe him, that the Tathagata has abandoned, its root destroyed, made like a palmyra stump, deprived of the conditions of development, not destined for future arising. Freed from the classification of form, Vaka, the Tathagata is deep, boundless, hard to fathom, like the great ocean. Similarly with feelings, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness. MN 72. In fact, as SN 2286 makes clear, fully awakened beings can't be defined even in this lifetime, even though they're obviously functioning and interacting with the world. What do you think, Anatta? Do you regard form as the Tathagata? No, Lord. Do you regard feeling as the Tathagata? No, Lord. Do you regard perception as the Tathagata? No, Lord. Do you regard fabrications as the Tathagata? No, Lord. Do you regard consciousness as the Tathagata? No, Lord. What do you think, Anatta? Do you regard the Tathagata as being in form, elsewhere than form, in feeling, elsewhere than feeling, in perception, elsewhere than perception, in fabrications, elsewhere than fabrications, in consciousness, elsewhere than consciousness? No, Lord. What do you think, Anatta? Do you regard the Tathagata as form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness? No, Lord. Do you regard the Tathagata as that which is without form, without feeling, without perception, without fabrications, without consciousness? No, Lord. And so, Anatta, the Tathagata not being pinned down by you as a truth or reality even in the present life, is it proper for you to declare, friends, the Tathagata, the supreme man, the superlative man, attainer of the superlative attainment, being described, is described otherwise than with these four positions? The Tathagata exists after death, doesn't exist after death, both does and doesn't exist after death, neither exists nor doesn't exist after death? No, Lord. Very good, Anatta, very good. Both formerly and now, it is only stress that I describe, and the cessation of stress. SN 2286. The verb I have translated here as not being pinned down, anupalabhyamano, can also be translated as not apprehended or not ascertained. The preceding series of questions, in which Anatta has been unable to define precisely what a Tathagata is, even though he's conversing with one, suggests the translation I've adopted in this case. But however you translate the verb, the context provided by SN 23-2 and SN 2236 makes clear that the sentence as a whole means that because the Tathagata, devoid of clinging, can't be measured or defined even in this lifetime, there's no way that you can legitimately describe him after death in any of the terms of the tetralemma, or in any other way at all. As for the Suttas' strategic reasons for why the Buddha and his disciples wouldn't take any of the four positions, these fall into two subsets. The first subset states that the attempt to answer the question of whether the Tathagata exists after death isn't relevant to the practice leading to the end of suffering, and actually can get in the way by entangling you in a snare of views. A Tathagata exists after death, I have taught and declared to be a not categorical teaching. A Tathagata doesn't exist after death. A Tathagata both exists and doesn't exist after death. A Tathagata neither exists nor doesn't exist after death, I have taught and declared to be a not categorical teaching. And why have I taught and declared these teachings to be not categorical? Because they are not conducive to the goal, are not conducive to the Dhamma, are not basic to the holy life. They don't lead to disenchantment, to dispassion, to cessation, to calm, to direct knowledge, to self-awakening, to unbinding. DN 9. Vaka. The position that the Tathagata exists after death. The Tathagata doesn't exist after death. The Tathagata both exists and doesn't exist after death. The Tathagata neither exists nor doesn't exist after death, is a thicket of views, a wilderness of views, a contortion of views, a writhing of views, a fetter of views. It is accompanied by suffering, distress, despair, and fever, and it does not lead to disenchantment, dispassion, cessation, to calm, direct knowledge, self-awakening, unbinding. MN 72. The second subset of strategic reasons derives from the fact that the desire to take any of these four positions is inspired by unskillful states of mind. To answer the questions would be to encourage these unskillful states, and thus get in the way of awakening. For instance, the Tathagata exists after death. This craving standpoint, this perception standpoint, this product of conceiving, this product of elaboration, this clinging standpoint, that's anguish. The Tathagata doesn't exist after death, that's anguish. The Tathagata both exists and doesn't exist after death, that's anguish. The Tathagata neither exists nor doesn't exist after death, that's anguish. The uninstructed run-of-the-mill person doesn't discern anguish, doesn't discern the origination of anguish, doesn't discern the cessation of anguish, doesn't discern the path of practice leading to the cessation of anguish, and so for him that anguish grows. He is not freed from birth, aging, and death, from sorrows, lamentations, pains, distresses, and despairs. He is not freed, I tell you, from suffering and stress. And 751. For one whose passion for form has not been removed, whose desire, affection, thirst, fever, craving for form has not been removed, there occurs the thought that the Tathagata exists after death, or the Tathagata doesn't exist after death, or the Tathagata both exists and doesn't exist after death, or the Tathagata neither exists nor doesn't exist after death. Similarly with the other four aggregates, SN 44-5. It's because of these formal and strategic reasons that, if we're serious about getting the most out of the Buddhist teachings, we should try to avoid taking any position on what a fully awakened person is, before or after death, and instead to follow the example of the Suttas. This means two things. First, we can gain motivation in the practice from its similes for why such persons are indescribable. They're hard to measure like the ocean, and they're freed from location like a fire released from its clinging/sustenance. Upadana. What do you think, Vaka? If a fire were burning in front of you, would you know that this fire is burning in front of me? Yes. And if someone were to ask you, Vaka, is fire burning in front of you, dependent on what is it burning? Thus asked, how would you reply? I would reply, this fire burning in front of me is burning dependent on grass and timber as its sustenance. Upadana. If the fire burning in front of you were to go out, would you know that this fire burning in front of me has gone out? Yes. And if someone were to ask you, this fire that has gone out in front of you, in which direction from here has it gone? East, west, north, or south? Thus asked, how would you reply? That doesn't apply, Master Gotama. Any fire burning dependent on a sustenance of grass and timber, being unnourished from having consumed that sustenance and not being offered any other, is classified simply as out, unbound. In the same way, Vaka, any form by which one describing the Tathagata would describe him, that the Tathagata has abandoned, its root destroyed, made like a palmyra stump, deprived of the conditions of development, not destined for future arising. Freed from the classification of form, Vaka, the Tathagata is deep, boundless, hard to fathom, like the great ocean. Similarly with feelings, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness. MN 72. Gone to the beyond of becoming, you let go of in front, let go of behind, let go of between. With a heart everywhere released, you don't come again to birth and aging. DHP 348. Sister Suba, I, unimpassioned, unblemished, with a mind everywhere released, knowing the unattractiveness of fabricated things, my heart adheres nowhere at all. Fig 14. Vendravada, right before passing away. So then, I'm about to unbind. I'm released. Everywhere. Fag 14. Ven, Anuruddha, on the Buddha's passing away. Like a flame's unbinding, was the liberation of awareness. Dien 16. Satos, the word translated as awareness in this last verse, can also be translated as mind. Second, we should focus not on what such persons are, but on the example provided by what they've done. This, after all, is the most important thing to know about them, so that we can get an idea of what we have to do to join their ranks. Rahants, whose effluents are ended, who have reached fulfillment, done the task, laid down the burden, attained the true goal, laid to waste the fetter of becoming, and who are released through right gnosis. MN 118. Vakagata, this contemplative Gotama, describes a disciple who has died and passed on in terms of places of rebirth. That one is reborn there, that one is reborn there. But when the disciple is an ultimate person, a foremost person, attained to the foremost attainment, the contemplative Gotama doesn't describe him, when he has died and passed on, in terms of places of rebirth. That one is reborn there, that one is reborn there. Instead, he describes him thus: he has cut through craving, severed the fetter, and by rightly breaking through conceit has made an end of suffering and stress. Kama SN 44-9.